Now I will tell you a tale of two kingdoms divided by war, of a prince and a princess whose love was forbidden, yet burned brighter than the flames of hatred that had consumed their lands for generations. It is a tale of courage, of sacrifice, and of a love strong enough to heal a broken world. The kingdoms of Eldoria and Dravengarde had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember. Their kings sat upon thrones carved from the bones of the past, their banners rising high upon the winds of war. Eldoria, the land of golden fields and silver rivers, was a kingdom of scholars and enchantments, ruled by the wise but weary King Alden. Dravengarde, a land of towering mountains and dark forests, was a warrior's realm, its people hardened by cold and battle, ruled by the fierce and unyielding King Dane. For generations, their hatred had been passed down like an heirloom, a war that neither king had started yet neither would end. To call the other an enemy was as natural as breathing. But love does not listen to war. In secret, beneath the cover of night, Prince Caelan of Eldoria and Princess Lysandra of Dravengarde met where their father's swords could not reach them. They had first seen each other at the signing of a fragile truce, a meeting that had lasted but a fortnight before crumbling into dust. And yet, in those stolen days they had spoken. And in speaking they had fallen into something that neither kingdom could ever allow. Now, beneath the twisted branches of the moonshade grove, where no soldiers dared patrol, they met once more. The prince, wrapped in a dark cloak, his silver hair catching the moonlight. The princess, her emerald eyes filled with both longing and sorrow. Each time they met, they risked everything, yet neither could bear to turn away. Lysandra told him of the battles her father planned, of the warriors that trained day and night in the frozen halls of Dravengarde. Caelan spoke of the spells his people wove, of the council that whispered that war was the only answer. Each night, they dreamed of an impossible future, one where swords were laid to rest and love did not have to hide. But fate is not kind to lovers caught between war. For deep within the blackened hills beyond both their kingdoms, Soranna the Hollow watched through her enchanted mirror, her lips curling into a cruel smile. The witch of the forgotten woods, the weaver of curses and the mistress of shadows, had long waited for a moment such as this. She needed power. Power that only the blood of a royal heart could grant. And so, as the two lovers whispered of hope, as Caelan pressed a promise into Lysandra's palm, swearing that one day he would end the war, the wind shifted. The trees groaned. And then, in a swirl of darkness, she was gone. Lysandra had vanished. Caelan's heart pounded as he spun, but the grove was empty. No sound, no sign, only the cold whisper of magic fading into the night. Far beyond the lands of men, in a tower built from stone as black as the abyss, Soranna watched as her prize lay unconscious before her. The princess's golden hair was spread across the icy floor, her breath slow, her magic already beginning to seep into the sorceress's veins. One royal heart would have been enough, but now she had drawn the prince into her web as well, and fate would lead him straight into her hands. The silence in the moonshade grove was thick with dread. The trees, once gentle and watchful, loomed like silent sentinels over the clearing where Prince Caelan stood alone. The air still hummed with the fading remnants of dark magic, and the place where Princess Lysandra had been only moments before was nothing but empty earth. His breath came in ragged gasps as his mind struggled to comprehend what had happened. A moment ago she had been in his arms, whispering of their dream of a future beyond war, and now she was gone. Not taken by soldiers nor lost to the night, but swallowed by something far more sinister. He could feel it in his bones, sorcery. A shudder ran through him. Eldoria had its scholars, its enchantments woven for protection, for wisdom, for healing. But this was something older, something vile. He had heard whispers of a being that dwelled beyond the borders of both their kingdoms, in a place where the dead did not rest and the sun never reached. A sorceress whose name was spoken only in fear. Soranna the Hollow. A name from nightmares. A name from stories meant to frighten children. A name he had never dared believe was real, until now. His first instinct was to ride back to Eldoria, to summon his father's court, to send word to Lysandra's people to raise an army. But he knew what that would mean. War. A true war. A war neither kingdom could survive. If he rode into his father's halls and told him that the princess of Dravengarde had been stolen, his father would believe it to be a trick, a ploy by King Dane. And if King Dane learned that his daughter was missing, stolen from a secret meeting with a prince of Eldoria, he would see only treachery. They would blame each other. And the war that had simmered for a century would ignite into an inferno. Caelan could not allow that. His hands tightened into fists. He had only one choice. He would find Lysandra himself. But he would need help. And so, before the first light of dawn touched the land, the prince left behind his castle, his title, and his claim to the throne, slipping into the world as nothing more than a lone rider upon a shadowed road. For 3 days he rode without rest. His path took him from the golden fields of Eldoria to the desolate highlands that marked the edge of the known world. Villages dotted the landscape, their houses old and weathered, their people wary of strangers. It was in these forgotten places, where the law of kings held little sway, that legends lived. In the first village he asked an old woman of the witch. She crossed herself and spoke of the hollow woods, where the trees bled black sap and the spirits of the cursed wandered. In the second village, a blind seer told him of Soranna's mirror, a glass of endless depth in which he could see all things past and future. In the third, an old warrior, his face lined with scars, told him of the wraith-bound, the creatures that served the sorceress. They were neither living nor dead, bound by a curse older than time, their eyes empty but always watching. No man who had entered Soranna's domain had ever returned. None of it deterred Caelan. It was in the fourth village that he found the man he sought. A man who had ventured closer to Soranna's realm than any other and lived to tell of it. Garrick the Wanderer sat hunched in the corner of a dimly lit tavern, his cloak tattered, his once strong hands weathered by time and regret. He had been a knight once, one of Dravengarde's finest, until he had taken a quest into the dark lands and returned as something less than whole. He spoke little at first, his voice gravelly, his gaze hollow. But when he looked at Caelan, something flickered in his eyes, recognition. The boy was a prince, but he was more than that. He was desperate. And Garrick knew desperation. He leaned forward, speaking in a voice just above a whisper. There was a way into Soranna's lair. But no man could walk it and remain unchanged. The journey to the hollow woods was one few had taken, and even fewer had returned from. But Caelan was not alone. Garrick agreed to lead him as far as the Vale, the cursed border where the land itself rebelled against the presence of men. Beyond that, Caelan would walk alone. 4 days they rode through desolation. The forests grew twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. The rivers ran black, poisoned by whatever darkness seeped from the heart of Soranna's domain. And then at last they stood before the Vale. It was not a wall, not a gate, not a mountain. It was simply emptiness. A great chasm of swirling mist, shifting shadows, and whispers that were not wind. No birds flew overhead. No stars shone beyond. It was as though the world itself ended here and only nightmares remained. Garrick did not step forward. His own journey had ended long ago. But he placed a hand on the prince's shoulder, his grip strong despite his years. Caelan stepped into the mist, and the shadows swallowed him whole. The world beyond the veil was not like the one he had left. It was neither night nor day but something in between. The sky was gray and endless, the trees twisted, their trunks blackened with age. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of magic that did not belong to men. And he was not alone. The wraithbound moved through the mists, their bodies half seen, their hollow eyes gleaming. They did not walk, they drifted, moving as though caught in a wind that did not touch the trees. They had no voices, yet he could hear them, whispering without words, surrounding him with the weight of the dead. He did not run. Running would do no good. He did not draw his sword. Blades could not cut what had no flesh. Instead he walked, steady, unafraid. He did not know how long he walked. Time had no meaning here. But at last the mist thinned, and before him rose a tower of black stone, jagged and broken, as though it had been torn from the bones of the world itself. And at its peak, a single window burned with pale blue light. He had found her. But as he stepped forward, the whispers grew louder. The shadows deepened. And then, the world shattered. A force struck him from nowhere, a blast of wind and darkness that sent him crashing to the cold earth. The air trembled. A voice filled the sky, not a whisper now, but something vast and powerful. "You have come far, little prince?" Through the haze of pain, Caelan lifted his gaze. And there, standing upon the steps of the Black Tower, was Soranna the Hollow. Her robes were woven from shadows, her hair white as bone, her eyes burning like the dying embers of a forgotten fire. She smiled. And the prince knew that his true trial had only just begun. The tower of Soranna the Hollow loomed over the ruined land, its jagged spires clawing at the sky like the bones of a fallen god. The air was thick with something unseen, a presence, a weight, a hunger. It seeped into the very ground, curling through the broken stones like mist, whispering of things long forgotten. And standing upon the steps of the Black Tower, watching Prince Caelan with eyes like dying embers, was the witch herself. Soranna was neither young nor old. Her face was ageless, as if time itself had tried to mark her and failed. Shadows clung to her like a living thing, twisting and writhing with each movement. She tilted her head, regarding the prince as one might observe a caged bird, curious, amused, and utterly in control. Caelan forced himself to stand, his body aching from the force that had thrown him to the ground. His heart pounded, but he did not let the fear take hold. He had come this far. He would not falter now. The witch's voice echoed through the empty space around them, smooth as silk, cold as steel. She had been expecting him. Of course she had. The stars had foretold his coming, the wind had whispered his name. She had watched him wander through the villages, gathering tales, searching for answers. She had let him find his way to her gates. It amused her. Caelan did not waste time with anger or threats. He knew neither would serve him here. Instead, he spoke the only truth that mattered. He had come for Princess Lysandra. Soranna's lips curled into a knowing smile. The air around her trembled, and with a flick of her wrist, the shadows behind her shifted. There, half hidden in the darkness, bound by chains of light that pulsed like veins of molten silver, was Lysandra. Her gown was torn, her golden hair tangled, but her eyes burned with defiance. She was pale, weakened but alive. And as soon as she saw him, her expression, once filled with despair, changed. Caelan's breath caught. She reached toward him, but the chains tightened, holding her still. A sharp, searing magic filled the space between them. The closer he stepped, the heavier the air became, as if the very tower itself sought to hold him back. Soranna's laughter echoed through the ruined halls. Did he think she would simply give the princess back? She had stolen Lysandra for a reason, a purpose that stretched beyond the desires of kings and kingdoms. But she was not without mercy. If Caelan wished to free the princess, she would offer him a bargain, a single task, one that would test not just his strength but his soul. And if he succeeded, she would let Lysandra go. But if he failed, if he hesitated, if he faltered, if he proved unworthy, he would never leave this place again. The prince's fists clenched. He did not ask what the task was. He did not ask what danger awaited him. He already knew his answer. He would do it. Soranna's smile widened. Then so it would be. The shadows shifted once more, and the ground beneath them trembled. A dark mist coiled around Caelan's feet, stretching outward, forming a path that led away from the tower, toward something unseen, hidden within the depths of the cursed land. A task awaited him, a trial unlike any other, and his soul would be the price if he failed. The path before Prince Caelan was unlike any road he had ever walked. The shadows beneath Soranna's tower twisted and writhed, forming a bridge of black mist that stretched into the unknown. It led him away from the witch's cursed domain, into the deepest, most forsaken part of the land, the Valley of the Forgotten. The air here was different. It was heavy, thick with something unseen. A whisper of lost souls drifted through the valley, though no wind stirred the ground. The land was dead but not silent. It watched him. It waited. Behind him, Soranna the Hollow stood upon the steps of her black tower, her presence like an unshaken storm. She had given him his task. If he wished to free Princess Lysandra, he would have to retrieve something from the valley. A relic older than either of their kingdoms. A heart of stone. Not a simple gemstone or an artifact buried in the earth, but an actual heart. One that had once belonged to a warrior long since lost to legend. A heart that no longer beat, yet still pulsed with power. A heart that had turned to stone the day its owner was betrayed and slain. And if the stories were true, the warrior who had once owned it was still there, waiting for vengeance. Caelan did not look back. He did not hesitate. He stepped onto the blackened path, and the shadows swallowed him whole. The Valley of the Forgotten was a place untouched by time. No sun shone here, nor did the moon rise. The sky above was a swirling abyss, shifting in colors that did not belong to the waking world. The land stretched endlessly, littered with ruins of battles long lost, weapons rusted, banners torn, armor broken and abandoned. But there were no bodies. The warriors who had died here had not been given the mercy of rest. Caelan could feel them. Not as ghosts nor as shadows, but as something worse. Their spirits clung to the valley, neither living nor dead. They had no voices, yet their agony filled the air. They had no eyes, yet he could feel them watching. And in the center of the valley, half buried beneath the earth, stood a ruined throne. It was cracked, covered in vines that had long since turned to ash, its once golden markings blackened by time. And upon that throne sat a figure clad in rusted armor, unmoving, untouched by the passing centuries. A knight forgotten by history. His name had been lost, erased by time, but Caelan knew who he was. The fallen guardian, once the greatest champion of a forgotten kingdom, now nothing more than a curse bound to the valley. And in his chest, barely visible through the cracks in his armor, was the heart of stone. Caelan took a slow step forward. The sound of his foot upon the ground echoed like a bell through the valley. The figure stirred. The warrior's helm was broken, revealing a hollow face, his once proud features lost to time. His eyes, empty, lifeless, yet burning with something ancient and terrible, fixed upon Caelan. And then the voice came. Not from the knight's mouth but from the valley itself. A voice woven from sorrow and rage, bound by the weight of betrayal. Who dares disturb my rest? The ground shook. The sky darkened. The warrior's fingers curled into fists. Caelan did not draw his sword. He knew that no steel could slay something that was already dead. Instead he spoke the only truth that mattered. He had come for the heart. A silence fell over the valley. Then the voice of the forgotten warrior whispered, low and cold. Then you have come to take what is mine, and for that you must pay the price. The knight rose from the throne, his movements slow but filled with the weight of centuries. His broken sword, rusted yet still deadly, was drawn from its sheath. And the trial began. Caelan did not fight with brute strength. He was not the strongest warrior nor the fastest. But he was trained well, a prince raised by Eldoria's greatest swordsman. He knew that this was not a battle of power but of endurance. The fallen guardian did not move like a man. He did not tire, did not hesitate. His blade struck with the weight of time itself, and each clash of their weapons sent shudders through the earth. Caelan dodged. He countered. He fought with everything he had. But the knight did not weaken. The prince's breathing grew ragged. His strength waned. He knew he could not win a battle of steel. And then, as he dodged another strike, his eyes caught something, an inscription upon the ruined throne. A name. The warrior's name, long since erased from history. Elydris. It struck him like lightning. This was not just a cursed warrior. This was a man who had been betrayed. A man who had once stood for something, who had given everything for a kingdom that had abandoned him. And Caelan understood. This was not a fight that could be won with a sword. It could only be won with honor. He cast his weapon aside. The act stunned the knight, if only for a moment. Then, with steady breath, Caelan spoke. He did not challenge the warrior. He did not demand the heart. Instead, he swore an oath. He spoke Elydris's name. He acknowledged the warrior's sacrifice. And with a voice strong and unyielding, he swore to remember him. To ensure that his name would not be lost to time. To carry his story beyond the valley, beyond the curse. The knight's blade hovered in the air, trembling. The echoes of sorrow, of rage, of betrayal wavered. And then, the guardian fell to his knees. The mist around them shifted, as if a great weight had been lifted. The valley seemed to breathe, the whispers fading into silence. And the heart of stone, the relic of legend, broke free from the warrior's chest. Caelan caught it in his hands. It pulsed once as if it still remembered what it had once been. He had done it. The trial was over. But as he turned back toward Soranna's lair, heart in hand, he knew one truth above all. The witch had not given him this task simply to test him. She had sent him here to change him. And though he had won, he was no longer the same man who had stepped into the valley. The Valley of the Forgotten lay silent behind Prince Caelan as he walked away, the heart of stone clutched tightly in his hand. It was heavier than it should have been, pulsing faintly, as though the remnants of its former owner's sorrow still lingered within it. The weight of it was not just physical. It carried the burden of a promise. He had spoken Elidris's name. He had sworn to remember. And now he carried more than just a relic. He carried a man's legacy. His body ached from the battle, his wounds burning from where the cursed warrior's blade had grazed him. But he did not slow. The mist around him thickened once more, the path shifting, the world twisting into something unnatural. This was no ordinary land. This was Soranna's domain, where reality was shaped by her will. The black tower loomed ahead, its spires disappearing into the endless gray sky. The closer he drew, the more he felt it. A sense of wrongness, a presence that coiled around the edges of his mind. The witch was waiting. He stepped through the gates, into the ruined halls where Soranna the Hollow watched from her throne of stone and shadow. The air trembled around her, darkness twisting like living smoke at her fingertips. She smiled as he entered, as if she had known all along that he would return. He had fulfilled her task. He had brought her the heart of stone. And now she was bound by her word. Or so he thought. The prince lifted the heart of stone, his grip firm, his voice steady. He had done as she asked. Now she would release Lysandra. Soranna's golden eyes gleamed with amusement. Her lips curled, not in anger but in something worse, satisfaction. Had he truly believed it would be so simple? Her voice was smooth as silk, yet woven with hidden thorns. She had promised to free the princess if he completed her task, and indeed he had completed it. But she had never said how she would free her. A flick of her hand and Lysandra's chains vanished, but the princess did not rise. Her body remained still, her breathing shallow. A faint, silvery glow surrounded her, wrapping around her form like an invisible shroud. She was free from the chains. But she was still bound. Caelan's blood ran cold. Soranna had tricked him. She had no intention of letting Lysandra go. The task had never been about proving his worth. It had been about changing him, testing him, breaking him. And the trial had left its mark. Soranna's eyes flickered to the heart of stone in his hand, her expression unreadable. Did he feel it? The weight of it? The burden? The truth? That was the power of sacrifice. A warrior's heart turned to stone by betrayal. A prince who had risked his soul to retrieve it. A princess now bound by magic unseen. It was all connected. And if Caelan wished to truly free Lysandra, then one last choice remained. The heart had once belonged to a fallen warrior. A man who had given everything, his life, his name, his soul. Now the heart belonged to Caelan. And the only way to break the final spell was to take its place. Soranna's smile deepened as realization dawned in his eyes. She did not need to chain Lysandra. Not when she could offer the prince something far more dangerous. A bargain. Trade the princess's soul for his own. Give up his future, his throne, his kingdom, his name, and take the heart into himself. To replace the one who had come before him. To become the next forsaken guardian. The last prince of Eldoria lost to legend. Forever. Silence filled the cursed hall. Caelan's grip on the heart tightened. He felt its weight, felt the pulse of the warrior's sorrow, the cold remnants of a man long forgotten. The choice burned in his chest. Lysandra's life, or his own? A trap. A cruel game. A sorceress's perfect trick. But Soranna had underestimated him. She believed he had only two choices, to accept or to refuse. To lose himself or to lose Lysandra. But he was a prince. A warrior. A man who had sworn not only to save the woman he loved, but to end the war between their kingdoms. He would not be bound by the rules of a witch's game. And in that moment he made his choice. Not to trade, not to surrender, but to break the game entirely. He crushed the heart of stone in his hands. A flash of light, a tremor in the earth. The air shattered like glass as the magic within the heart was released, not into him, not into another curse, but into the world itself. The spell binding Lysandra broke. The magic anchoring the valley collapsed. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the Forsaken were free. The tower trembled. The mist writhed. And Soranna's eyes, for the first time, widened in shock. Caelan had won. But the battle was far from over, because the witch had no intention of letting him leave alive. The heart of stone shattered like fragile glass in Prince Caelan's hands, and in that instant the world changed. The spell that had bound Princess Lysandra unraveled like a dying flame. The chains of silver light faded, the curse lifting from her body. She gasped as air filled her lungs, her emerald eyes flickering open for the first time since her capture. But the tower was not silent. The moment the heart was broken, Soranna the Hollow screamed. The sound was like 1,000 voices crying out in agony, a wail of rage and disbelief that shook the very foundation of her domain. The shadows twisted violently, the air cracking with raw, ancient power. For centuries, the magic of the Forsaken had belonged to her, woven into the fabric of her curses, anchoring her dominion over the Hollow Lands. And now, in one reckless, defiant act, Caelan had severed her hold. The souls trapped in the Valley of the Forgotten were free, and Soranna's power was breaking apart. But she was still dangerous. The witch's golden eyes burned with fury as she rose from her throne, her form shifting, twisting, darkening. The shadows around her gathered, wrapping her in a swirling mass of magic, her very presence warping the air. Her voice, once smooth and knowing, now carried nothing but hatred. Did he think he had won? Did he think she would let him leave? Did he believe that a mere prince could defy a power as old as the land itself? The room trembled. The stones of the tower cracked. And Soranna struck. A force of pure, ancient magic erupted from her outstretched hands, a storm of darkness that swallowed the chamber whole. A curse meant to consume not only Caelan but Lysandra as well. But Caelan was ready. He threw himself in front of Lysandra, raising his arms as the magic surged toward them like a tidal wave of shadow. The power crashed against him, slamming into his body with the force of 1,000 storms. He did not scream. He did not fall. Instead, the magic recoiled. The shattered remnants of the heart of stone still clung to his skin, its last traces of power lingering in his blood. And as the dark magic struck him, it was repelled, not by a spell, not by an enchantment, but by something greater. By the promise he had made. To never forget. To carry the memory of Elydris, the fallen warrior. To honor the sacrifice of those who had come before him. And so, the curse did not take him. It turned against the one who had cast it. Soranna staggered back, her hands trembling as the magic tore away from her, unraveling like a frayed thread. Her power, once vast, once limitless, was unraveling with it. For centuries she had been bound to the Forsaken, feeding on their sorrow, anchoring herself in their torment. But now there was nothing left to hold her together. Her golden eyes widened, not in rage now, but in horror. The shadows that had once obeyed her twisted against her will. The mist that had once protected her began to consume her instead. She screamed, but it was not a cry of rage this time. It was the sound of something ancient unraveling. And in a final desperate act, she tried to cling to Caelan's soul, reaching with magic that was no longer hers, seeking something, anything, to anchor her existence. But Caelan did not falter. He raised his sword, and with a single strike he severed her grasp. The witch's body shattered like glass, dissolving into the darkness, her final scream lost to the winds that swept through the crumbling tower. And then, silence. The storm had ended. The darkness had passed. And Soranna the Hollow was no more. Caelan turned, his heart still pounding, his breath still ragged. Lysandra stood before him, her gaze filled with both awe and sorrow. For a moment neither of them spoke. There were no words for what had just transpired. Then, without hesitation, she threw herself into his arms. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her, feeling the life that had nearly been stolen. And in that moment nothing else mattered. Not the war. Not the kingdoms. Just them. But they could not stay. The tower, Soranna's domain, was collapsing. The land, once held together by her dark magic, was crumbling into ruin. They had to escape. Hand in hand they ran. Through the ruined halls. Down the broken staircases. Past the doors that no longer led anywhere. Until at last they emerged into the cold open air. The hollow lands, once thick with mist, once filled with the whispers of the dead, were now silent. The sky, once an endless swirl of gray, was clear. For the first time in 1,000 years the curse had been broken. The valley was free. And so were they. But their journey was not yet over. Because now they had to return home. And they had to face the war that still raged between their kingdoms. For Caelan and Lysandra had defied fate itself. But would their fathers listen to reason? Or would the love they had fought for be torn apart by the swords of men? The path back to the kingdoms was long, but Prince Caelan and Princess Lysandra could not afford to waste a single moment. The war between Eldoria and Dravengarde had likely already begun. 4 days they traveled unseen, avoiding the roads where patrols might spot them. The forests were thick with tension. Villages that had once been bustling with life now stood half empty, their people forced into hiding as the armies marched. The world was shifting, breaking under the weight of old hatred. By the time they reached the borderlands, the sky itself seemed darker, as if it too knew what was coming. Smoke curled into the air from distant fires. The drums of war rumbled across the valley like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. At the Eldorian war camp, King Alden stood upon the highest ridge, his silver cloak flowing in the wind, his gaze locked upon the battlefield below. He was not a man who sought war, but neither was he one to back down. For years he had tried to keep the peace, but King Dane of Dravengarde had forced his hand. First with threats, then with raids upon their borders. And now Dane had stolen his son. The reports had been clear. Prince Caelan had vanished, last seen near the northern forests, far too close to Dravengarde's lands. To Alden there was no doubt. His enemies had taken him. So he would burn their armies to the ground. On the other side of the battlefield, King Dane prepared his own warriors. His steel-clad knights stood in formation, their faces hardened by war. The Eldorians had crossed the line. They had sent spies into his land. And worst of all, they had taken Lysandra. Dane had spent his life fighting Eldoria. He had bled for Dravengarde. He had sworn never to let his kingdom fall to Eldorian hands. And now they dared to steal his only daughter? He would tear them apart. Neither king knew the truth. Neither king knew that Caelan and Lysandra had not been taken, but had left of their own free will. Neither king knew that their children were coming back. Not to fight, but to stop the war before it was too late. They rode hard through the night, their cloaks snapping in the wind, their hearts pounding in unison. Lysandra's fingers clutched the reins tightly, her emerald eyes filled with worry. The battlefield was just ahead. They could already hear the distant clash of steel, the war horns calling men to their deaths. And then they saw it. From the high ridge they looked down upon the valley. Thousands of warriors stood at the brink of battle. The banners of Eldoria and Dravengarde rippled in the wind, their soldiers lined up in deadly formation. Siege engines creaked into place. Archers raised their bows. The kings sat atop their war horses, staring each other down across the field. One command, one single word, and the war would begin. Caelan's heart thundered in his chest. They were out of time. Lysandra turned to him, her breath unsteady. They had to do something. No. And so, with nothing but their voices, their courage, and the love that had defied fate itself, they rode into the heart of the storm. Straight between the armies. Straight into the fire. Straight into destiny. The ground trembled beneath the weight of two kingdoms on the brink of war. From the high ridge where the two armies faced each other, banners rippled in the wind. Eldoria's soldiers stood in silver and blue, their spears raised, their war horses restless beneath them. Across the battlefield, the warriors of Dravengarde, clad in black steel, gripped their swords, their shields locked in perfect formation. The world stood still. And then, the horns of war sounded. The first archers lifted their bows. The generals raised their swords. The kings, King Alden of Eldoria and King Dane of Dravengarde, prepared to give the order that would unleash an unstoppable storm of blood and steel. But before the command could be given, before the first arrow could fly, two riders burst into the battlefield. Caelan and Lysandra rode straight into the space between the two armies, their cloaks streaming behind them, their horses kicking up dust as they galloped into the heart of impending destruction. Gasps rippled through the ranks. A prince, a princess, together. The warriors on both sides hesitated. Alden's eyes widened as he saw his son, alive, riding toward him. Dane's breath caught as he recognized his daughter, unharmed, but with the Eldorian prince at her side. And then, whispers. The soldiers murmured to one another, uncertain. They had been told their enemy had stolen their prince. They had been told their princess had been kidnapped. But here they were, together. Side by side. Riding as one. Caelan's voice rang across the battlefield, filled with urgency, with defiance, with the fire of a man who would not let his people die for a war built on lies. Stop this. The war is a lie. We were never taken, we left. His voice carried over the stunned silence, his words cracking the foundations of old hatred. Lysandra lifted her head, her emerald eyes blazing. We are not enemies. We are not prisoners. We are here because we choose to be. And at last, the kings listened. A deathly silence fell over the battlefield. The two rulers rode forward, their war horses stepping carefully over the blood-soaked earth. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the soldiers who watched, waiting. For a long moment, neither king spoke. Then Alden's voice, rough with emotion, broke the silence. Caelan. The prince turned, meeting his father's gaze. For the first time in his life, he saw something other than duty in the king's eyes. He saw fear, relief, love. Dane's voice followed, low and sharp. Lysandra, tell me the truth. Were you taken? She straightened in her saddle, her voice steady, unwavering. No, father. I went willingly. I love him. The words shook the air like a war cry, like a spell, like something too powerful to be ignored. Gasps rippled through both armies. A prince and a princess, sworn enemies, and yet they stood together. Not in chains, not in captivity, but in love. King Alden's fingers curled around the hilt of his sword. The weight of history, of duty, of vengeance, pressed upon his shoulders. King Dane's face was carved from stone, his jaw clenched. The memories of lost battles, fallen warriors, the blood of his ancestors burned through his thoughts. They had prepared for war their entire lives. But now their own children stood before them, demanding a different future. For the first time they hesitated. And in that hesitation, the war began to crumble. Then from the ranks of the soldiers, a figure stepped forward. Garrick the Wanderer, the old knight who had once led armies, who had once walked the path of war, but had turned away from it. His grizzled face was unreadable as he looked upon the two young royals, then back at the kings he had once served. And then he knelt before Caelan and Lysandra, a warrior of Eldoria, a man who had fought and bled for war, bowed to love instead. A murmur swept through the armies. Then another soldier stepped forward. Then another. The tide was turning, and the kings knew it. Alden's shoulders sank as he let out a slow breath. Dane closed his eyes. His hands shook, and finally, they lowered their swords. The war was over, and in its place, something new was about to begin. But not all wounds heal in a single moment. Not all hearts accept peace so easily. And as the banners of war fell, unseen eyes still watched from the shadows. For there were those who had thrived on war. And not all of them would let it go without a fight. The battlefield was silent. The banners of war, once raised high with unshaken fury, now hung limp in the wind. The warriors of Eldoria and Dravengarde, who had moments ago been prepared to fight to the death, stood in uneasy stillness. The war had been stopped, not by swords, not by victory, but by something no one had expected. A prince and a princess defying their fathers. A love that had refused to bow before hatred. And now peace stood within reach. King Alden of Eldoria and King Dane of Dravengarde stared at each other across the battlefield. They had fought each other for years, had lost brothers, friends, and soldiers in the bloodshed. The weight of their kingdoms, of generations of hatred, pressed heavily upon them. But their children had done what neither of them could. Caelan and Lysandra had ended the war. At last, King Alden turned his gaze to his son. "What would you ask of me, Caelan?" The prince did not hesitate. "Let me marry Lysandra. Let us unite our kingdoms so we never have to fight again." A stunned murmur rippled through the armies. An alliance. A bond unbreakable. King Dane exhaled slowly, studying his daughter. The fire in her eyes, the strength in her voice, it was not weakness that had brought her here. It was courage. And at last the warlord king nodded. "Then so it shall be." Cheers erupted through the ranks of warriors, swords raised not in battle but in triumph. Eldoria and Dravengarde, two lands divided by war, would finally become one. But not all rejoiced. Far beyond the battlefield, where the fires of war had once burned brightest, shadows moved. Not everyone wanted peace. Among the ranks of the Dravengarde warlords, there was one who had spent his life preparing for this war. One who had no interest in treaties or love or alliances. General Varric Blackblade. A man whose name was whispered in fear. A man who had led the bloodiest battles against Eldoria. A man who had promised that he would see King Alden kneel before him or die. And now that victory had been stolen. By a boy and a girl. By love. He would not allow it. As the king shook hands, as the soldiers cheered, Varric turned away. He rode from the battlefield, his face a mask of cold rage. He would not bow to peace. If the kings had forgotten their hatred, then it would be his duty to remind them. There was still one last war to be fought, and this time he would not fail. Back on the battlefield, Caelan and Lysandra stood side by side, their fingers intertwined, their hearts pounding as their dream finally became reality. They had won. They had stopped a war. They had forged a new future. But peace is a fragile thing. And in the shadows an enemy still watched. Waiting. Planning. And the greatest threat was yet to come. Peace was within reach. The kings of Eldoria and Dravengarde had laid down their swords, their hands clasped in an uneasy alliance. The armies, once enemies, now stood side by side, murmuring in disbelief. For the first time in generations the bloodshed was over. But peace does not come without a price. Prince Caelan and Princess Lysandra stood at the heart of it all, their fingers intertwined, their victory hard-won. They had defied the will of their fathers, the weight of history, and even the power of an ancient sorceress to bring their people together. But the war was not yet finished. Not while General Varric Blackblade still drew breath. The attack came without warning. As the kings turned to declare the treaty, a thunderous roar split the sky. From the ridge above the battlefield, Varric and his loyalists charged, their dark-cloaked riders thundering down the hillside like an avalanche of steel. The ground shook beneath the force of their descent. Varric's soldiers were those who thrived on war, men who had spent their entire lives waiting for this moment. And now their king had betrayed them, given up the fight without a single drop of Eldorian blood spilled. They would not accept peace. They would drown this day in fire and death. Caelan barely had time to shove Lysandra aside before the first arrows fell. Screams erupted as the traitorous warriors clashed against the unprepared armies, striking down those who had once been their brothers. The battlefield, meant to be a place of peace, became a war zone once more. King Alden barely managed to draw his sword before Varric himself rode toward him, black armor gleaming, eyes burning with hatred. The general had no interest in the young prince or princess. He wanted the kings. He wanted the war they had stolen from him. Steel met steel as Alden blocked Varric's first strike, the force nearly knocking him from his horse. The Eldorian king was a skilled warrior, but Varric was a monster of war, relentless and unyielding. And Alden was not young anymore. One wrong step, one missed block, and the warlord's blade sank deep into Alden's shoulder. The king staggered back, blood staining his silver cloak. And Varric raised his sword for the killing blow. But Caelan was faster. With a roar of fury, the prince threw himself between Varric and his father, his own blade clashing against the general's with a deafening clang. Varric's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can stop me, boy?" Caelan did not answer. He only fought. The two warriors clashed in a whirlwind of steel, swords flashing, the ground shifting beneath their feet as they dueled in the center of the battlefield. But Varric was stronger. He had spent years fighting men twice Caelan's size, cutting through battlefields like a force of nature. And with each blow, Caelan felt himself weakening. Varric's sword slashed across his arm, a shallow but painful cut. Then another across his side. The prince dropped to one knee, his breath ragged. His vision blurred. He had come so far. He had stopped a war. He had found love. He could not die now. But Varric saw the weakness. He lifted his sword, aiming for Caelan's heart. And then, a dagger flew through the air. Varric staggered back, a blade buried deep in his chest. His eyes widened. His lips parted in shock. And he turned to see Lysandra standing behind him. Her face was pale, her breath unsteady, but her hand was still outstretched, her second dagger poised to throw. She had saved him. The general stumbled, his strength failing. His gaze darkened. A Dravengarde princess, siding with an Eldorian prince? His voice was a whisper now, filled with something almost like regret, ***, perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps war has already been lost. Then his knees buckled and he fell. Varric Blackblade, the man who had lived for war, died before he could see another. And with him his rebellion collapsed. The battle was over. For the last time. The armies of Eldoria and Dravengarde stood in stunned silence. The war that had lasted generations had nearly been reignited in a single moment. But now the last great warlord of the Old Age was gone. And a new future could finally begin. The wedding took place beneath the open sky, where the battlefield had once stood. No longer a place of death, but a place of rebirth. Caelan and Lysandra stood together before both their fathers, before their people. And before the gods themselves they swore an oath. Not just to love each other. Not just to rule. But to end the cycle of war forever. And when they spoke the people cheered. Not as two kingdoms. But as one. And so, the tale of the war that never was became legend. The tale of the prince and princess who defied fate, who shattered the chains of hatred and built a world where swords could finally be laid to rest. And those shadows still whispered in the corners of the world, waiting for their time to rise again. For now peace reigned, and love had won.